one hand, I'm a little confused because I think what we're really saying to everyone is not that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, it's that Israel must maintain a nuclear monopoly in the region. That's what this is really all about. Otherwise, it sounded as though he was describing a pornographic film that he'd seen at some point, because the rest of it didn't make any damn sense. No one in the region, other than Israel, can be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. That's what this is about. Israel has over 300 weapons, immense destructive power that can be launched from air, missile, or sea. And no one in the region has any nuclear weapons. And what everyone in the region knows is that you must not have any, because having any threatens Israel. Now, what are we talking about with Israel? Well, we're talking about something much more than the defense of Israel. The defense of Israel went out the window back over a year ago when this event on the 7th of October, and we've talked about that before. I am absolutely skeptical of the notion that this was something that happened without the Israelis knowing about it and reacting to it. Complete nonsense. They're too competent, and they had that place under excellent surveillance. I don't believe that for a minute. But the narrative is we were attacked on 7 October, and this horrific attack is now justification for us to effectively dominate the whole region, because we in Israel will not be safe until everyone is subjugated. Stop and consider that we've learned a couple of very important things over the last few years. Number one, that our equipment, our organization, our tactics don't work on the battlefield that exists today. We live in a different world. We have a battlefield, or a battle space, as people like to call it, that has changed dramatically. I said, well, if we don't stop it, the Russians are going to crush the Ukrainians. And the voice at the other end said, well, everyone here says that the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are losing. And I said, first of all, that's wrong. It's not true. And then secondly, we have no interest in a war in that region. What we have an interest in is peace and stability. And whatever we can do to bring peace and stability to the region should be our top priority, because otherwise we have no stake in Eastern Ukraine whatsoever. So I think you've always had people like Gorka, like Waltz. They may have other names. It doesn't make any difference. They surround the president and they try to persuade him that nothing can happen unless we are somehow or another directly involved in it, even though it may have no.
So I don't see how we avoid being dragged in. The other thing is, look at the interaction between President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu whenever they're together. It's very clear that Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. He's very delighted. He's happy. And there are key people in all of the positions, deputies or primaries, all of whom are signed on for what Mr. Netanyahu wants. So I don't know how else to explain it. The question is, will it last? Is America first, in the true sense of the word, compatible with Israel first? We don't know. I don't think so. But until there's a reason for Americans to pay attention, and that means losses on the battlefield, at sea, in the air, I don't think much is going to change. We have to understand that the war for Israeli hegemony in the Middle East, or frankly, Jewish supremacy, which is the way the Arabs look at it, I think, is part of this larger global effort that he's describing. This is a power grab.
And secondly, that we have to impose a solution, because if we don't, we look weak. And this is back to the question of, how do we get a win for the boss? Wait a minute. This is not UFC night. This is not a college basketball match. This is life and death for millions of people at the moment in Ukraine. But if we're not careful, this could spread, not because of anything that President Putin wants to do, but because of the stupids who are ruling in Paris and London and Berlin. They could cause it to expand. And of course, that would be delightful for the fools. This is the sort of thing we tried in Georgia. The Russians intervened there militarily and killed it and put an end to it. We've tried to set up puppet regimes all over the place, ostensibly for the purpose of either harming or containing what we said was the dangerous state of Russia. All of this nonsense needs to come to an end. But I think the president is surrounded by people who are no less invested in the lie and the fiction than the man you just quoted. If you go through these people like Gorka and Waltz and Rubio, and others, my God, they live in a world that doesn't exist. It's all fiction. Let's stop for a minute and understand a couple of things that emerged from this Ukraine war that nobody else ever comes forward and mentions. Number one, what was demonstrated conclusively on the battlefield in Ukraine? What's been demonstrated conclusively is that NATO equipment, NATO military technology, which is in large measure American, is inferior to the equipment the Russians have brought to the battlefield. Secondly, NATO tactics, NATO operational art is stuck in the distant past. It's ill-suited to the modern battlefield. And the people that have paid the price for this, if he wants to be effective, he needs to toss our friend Zelensky overboard along with his corrupt regime. And all of the senior military officers involved in this tragedy from the United States should be removed. Get rid of them. If you keep them around, they will continue to subvert whatever President Trump does. They will try to restore chaos and conflict wherever they can. So it's not just a question of Zelensky. What do you do about the people in the CIA and the Department of Defense who've done everything in their power to mire us in this quicksand? They've got to go away too. So he's got to understand this is a much bigger issue than just for, and most of the time it makes no sense to turn to the military option, because once you do, everything is out of your control. You can't contain these things. You don't know where things will go next. And yet you have foolish people left and right.
That's why I said earlier, he's ultimately in charge. He's determining everything, and his agents inside the government and the White House are determining everything that happens. So quite frankly, you're no longer listening to a truly independent American government. This is very much an Israel first administration. Might as well come to terms with that, understand what it means, which is unconditional support for whatever the Israelis want to do, regardless of whether or not that actually supports or harms our interests. Doesn't make any difference. That's the position. That's where we are. Tammy did a great job of taking the right positions from that standpoint and saying exactly the same things that you would have heard from any cabinet member. Doesn't make any difference. Everyone in this administration, many people that are familiar with history know that if you create a category of people who are treated as privileged, immune, and beyond the law, effectively, you create targets. And eventually it all breaks down in hatred and violence. The first thing that Lenin did, or almost the first thing when he took over the Bolshevik Revolution, was outlaw essentially the same thing. He attacked anti-Semitism and tried to eliminate any opposition to anyone or anything that was Jewish, because most of his inner circle, and frankly, at least a third or more of the key members of the Bolshevik Revolution that took over after the Tsar was removed, they were Jewish. And so he wanted to protect them. I don't think that worked out very well in Russia. It didn't work out well in Europe at all. And I don't think it's going to work out very well here. I think it's a mistake. I would think if I were Jewish, I would want to attract a great deal less attention to myself and to those of us who are influential citizens, for fear that you get the opposite of what you're trying to protect.
Clearly, there's no willingness to use the United States Marine Corps, which one would have thought, if you were serious about this, that you would have landed some Marines somewhere. This is exactly the sort of thing for which the Marine Corps was originally devised. Raids ashore to destroy enemies or seize key points, harbors, and so forth. So it looks like it's possible, yes. That it certainly didn't apply to Senator McCain, who is behind that sort of thing in Syria and in northern Iraq, and actually went over to encourage turning the various Islamist organizations with equipment against, at the time, the Assad regime and his allies. So I guess this is nothing new, and yet another flagrant disregard for we would like to see the uninterrupted flow of commerce at sea moving through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. We have a permanent interest in that. And so that makes sense for the Navy to try and protect and enhance that as much as possible. The problem is that we are close, not just simply aligned, we are integrated into the larger Israeli offensive operation in the region. His chief of staff asked him on the eve of the German offensive into Belgium, or the Kaiser asked him, "General, can I stop this?" The answer to that was yes. He was the supreme warlord. But the general said, "No, Your Majesty, I don't think we can stop it." That's ridiculous. And that's what President Trump needs to think about, because effectively right now, he's in a similar position. He is more than just the run-of-the-mill president. He is standing on the threshold of potential disaster. He can stop it. All he has to say. In the meantime, we poured billions and billions into Ukraine for the purpose of building up what turned out to be the largest army in NATO. By the time the Russians went into Ukraine, you had almost 800,000 men under arms in Ukraine. They had some of the best equipment and weaponry that you could get. And they had ostensibly, in retrospect, the enormous benefit of American military leadership and strategy, and secondarily, British military leadership and strategy, which is a hell of a note, frankly, since it's been catastrophic for Ukraine. But the point is, President Trump might also think about taking his own advice when it comes to size and numbers. He was talking about Zelensky. Zelensky was promised by us that he would win because we would stand behind him and provide him with everything that we could. That was always a dangerous promise and not one that was likely to be fulfilled. This sort of thing goes on. Fox does it, CNN does it, all the mainstream media, because they're all part of the same cabal. In most cases, I think most of the people that want us to double down on failure in Ukraine want us to expand the war in the Middle East and go to war with virtually everyone in the region until the entire Middle East is subjugated to Israeli dominance and hegemony. So it's all part of the same thing. We've either got to wake up and dispose of these people and get them out because they present a clear and present danger to the survival of our country. That's something that people in Washington don't do. They never ask the question, we have to measure what we might gain by what we might lose. If you ask that question, you do not go to war with Russia and Eastern Europe. You do not go to war with Iran today. There's too much at stake for us, but we're not thinking in those terms, and we have no strategy. There is no strategic thinking in Washington at all. What I just outlined to you, I'm trying to give you an appreciation for what the Russians think, because they do think strategically. They act accordingly. There is a rational strategic calculus involved. That's why they went into Ukraine. We don't seem to have any. What we have are impulses. Yeah. One impulse today, a different impulse tomorrow, and everybody is hanging on every word from Donald Trump because he's seen as the man who verbally makes policy. The United States preference for proxies. We much rather use someone else's ground force against our opponents than do it ourselves. So I think there is very definitely an effort right now to organize and recruit from the elements that you just mentioned in the Saudi Peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, and use them on the ground while we bomb and support from.
By the way, I don't see any evidence that the Russians are in the least worried about it. The problem is, and we've been through this before, you're talking about fighting 6,000 to 10,000 miles away from home. That means that you're entirely dependent on very fragile logistical supply lines, most of which have to come by ship or air. You're also dependent upon a collection of strong points in Japan, Okinawa, places like that, even Australia. And they're not reliable because they're static, and anything static can be targeted. Anything you target can be destroyed. Frankly speaking, that's another one where I shake my head. People say we've got to pivot and spend billions and billions on new infrastructure in Asia. We have an infrastructure problem here at home. So I don't think it's going to happen. And I think a lot of this talk is a desire to seem strong or tough or masculine. It is crazy, to be frank with you. And the Chinese would win any contest in their home waters. He really would like to negotiate another agreement, which is also interesting since he jumped at the opportunity to throw the old one out. We'll see if it can be done. And then again, the wild card remains Mr. Netanyahu. What will he do? What will he tolerate? What will he reject? Because he's really running the show from behind the scenes. Tammy Bruce has done an excellent job of articulating the Israeli position. We used to try to be more even-handed. If you go back a few years ago, there's no effort at that at all, no attempt whatsoever. We don't remember the past in the United States. In fact, one of the reasons we don't remember the past is because at the time things happened, whether it was the intervention in Iraq, intervention in Afghanistan, intervention in Libya, intervention subsequently in Syria, most Americans paid no attention. The politicians in Washington learned the long-term lesson that you cannot sustain large casualties because those attract attention. So if you can bomb with impunity, long-range strike with impunity, and minimize the casualties that your side takes, the average American will pay little or no attention to what happens. But again, even the average American may never have paid any attention to begin with. That's the sad part. So the real question is, can we continue this process in the Middle East against Tehran? If Tehran continues to resist any negotiated settlement, and it's very difficult to imagine how they could sign up for what President Trump asked, because his ultimatum was actually more strident and left far less room for negotiation than the ultimatum presented by the Emperor of Austria to Serbia in 19. There's a reason why after the Germans conquered most of Europe by 1940, that we did not land until June of 1944, because it took all of those intervening years to wear down the German military machine on multiple fronts. But you're not doing any of that against the Chinese, and the Chinese are a much more difficult proposition. They're the largest fortress in the world. So you're taking on something from the sea and the air that you have no chance of fundamentally damaging and changing. The problem is the bombings haven't had the desired effect on the people on the ground in Yemen. They remain defiant. They seem to have survived these horrendous bombings. They still seem to be able to manufacture much of their own equipment, including missiles. They have access to satellite intelligence, probably via Iran, but potentially from Europe, Russia, elsewhere. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think the president, what's interesting is that the current president, was very anxious to withdraw all of our ground forces from the region out of concern that in any future war, these ground troops were indefensible. They were spread about in these small forward operating bases, most of which could not be protected from incoming intermediate range, medium range, short range missiles. So it's interesting to hear people now talk about that. I think the president is genuinely concerned about the safety and welfare of American soldiers on the ground and American airmen on the ground. No doubt in my mind. And that may be why even now there are talks going on behind the scenes between the government in Tehran and Washington. Now, I don't know the content of those talks, but as you and I have frequently mentioned, the president, on the other hand, we look foolish because we haven't fundamentally changed anything on the ground. And by the way, Colonel Gary Anderson wrote a pretty good article about the Marine Corps, explaining why the contemporary Marine Corps is not capable of moving to these points via sea, coming ashore, and rooting out the enemy. Because to be blunt, that is exactly what would be required if you really want to eliminate the Houthis and their capabilities. You've got to go in on the ground. Right now, it's over 50,000, and I think you have to include the naval forces at sea, as well as the air forces and Army ground elements in the region. We can expect at least 27,000 ground troops. I think we're in a position right now where the globalist ruling class, primarily in Western, but not exclusively Western Europe, is clinging tenaciously to power. We just saw Marine Le Pen, I think, judged unfairly and then ridiculously placed in prison. I suspect that France is within weeks of a tremendous revolution. I don't see how they get through the summer without it. This kind of behavior is not evidence for strength. It's evidence for weakness and fear. They're going to go down fighting as far as they're concerned. The initial strategy was to try and drag us into the war that we didn't want to fight in Eastern Europe. That failed miserably. And so the next stage was either we stand up, join hands, and try to march into war together, or we'll simply be removed from power and it's over. And I think they're sensing that it's over. So I don't take these things very seriously at all.
So I think he should shut up and tend to his horses at home. I wouldn't pay any attention to him at all. But this natural world order that he's talking about, the natural world order went out of existence after the First World War because we, in our efforts to rescue the British and the French from certain defeat, destroyed it. And it's never coming back. And what we've had is this artificial construct since 1945, entirely based on the assumption that we would rule the world financially, economically and militarily. We can't afford it. We've destroyed ourselves, and the world has changed. The Soviets, after World War II, everyone feared them, but you and I know they had terrible losses. They were in no position to go into another major war. And so we went on with this Cold War for decades. This started, you and I talked about this before the election, after the election, and have continued to talk about it. Suspend all support for Zelensky and this criminal regime, the most corrupt, one of the most, if not the most corrupt country in the world, where the population is being ruthlessly exploited by its own government, and millions of lives are lost and destroyed as a result, all unnecessarily. So he's got to make some profound changes. He needs to do it very quickly. Get rid of these people. If he doesn't, then he's going to be standing on the bridge of the Titanic, waving to the few people on lifeboats that were smart enough to get off. No one in the region, other than Israel, can be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. That's what this is about. Israel has over 300 weapons, immense destructive power that can be launched from air, missile, or sea. And no one in the region has any nuclear weapons. And what everyone in the region knows is that you must not have any, because having any threatens Israel. Now, what are we talking about with Israel? Well, we're talking about something much more than the defense of Israel. The defense of Israel went out the window back over a year ago when this event on the 7th of October, and we've talked about that before. I am absolutely skeptical of the notion that this was something that happened without the Israelis knowing about it and reacting to it. Complete nonsense. They're too competent, and they had that place under excellent surveillance. I don't believe that for a minute. But the narrative is we were attacked on 7 October, and this horrific attack is now justification for us to effectively dominate the whole region, because we in Israel will not be safe until everyone is subjugated. Remember, Mr. Netanyahu made it very clear he wants the Libyan solution for Iran, and I would argue that's Mr. Zelensky's solution for Russia. Mr. Trump is now dealing with two recalcitrant supposed allies with whom we have no official treaty whatsoever in either case.
Starmer? Good Lord, I'm surprised that the English population hasn't at least risen up and done away with him. That may yet happen. The situation in the West is very fragile. There have been attempts for the last 50 years to create what people referred to as an EU army. They even stood up an EU headquarters that was designed to be like the NATO deployable, and it failed. It just has gone nowhere, because until this point in time, Judge, no one in authority in Europe has been willing to invest any money in any of the critical capabilities, not just weapons, but also command and control. And they've been unwilling to adapt to new technology in any way. So these are empty threats. And I think that's why you've seen President Trump has largely ignored it, which he should. I think there's a great deal of talk, but I don't see much evidence for action. And you're talking essentially about London, Paris, and Berlin. And in Berlin, they had to vote to change a provision in the basic law so that they could exceed their budgetary limits. Frankly, it's very hard to believe. Military power takes time to develop and grow. It doesn't happen overnight. Usually, on average, it's about 10 years. And so whatever you invest today, you will begin to see an impact, provided the organization changes and adapts to the new technology, in about 5 years. But you won't have the full impact militarily on a battlefield for perhaps another 5. So I'm a little skeptical. Plus, you've got to look at the financial realities. Britain's about to go under financially. France isn't far behind. The Germans are in a lot of trouble.